So as we read the gospel lesson tonight, we split it up into a few different voices. And as I was preparing for this sermon, I thought about all the different characters that are in this story of Jesus' journey to the cross. And you know how sometimes when you hear a story or you watch a movie or you have maybe a play that you're watching, and there's all these different characters, and sometimes you identify with one character in that story or one voice that you hear. You really know how that person is feeling. So I want to kind of go over some of these characters a little bit. Kind of at the beginning, you have this group of soldiers that are coming in, and they're the ones that are just following orders. Then we have the chief priests. The chief priests that are blind to justice. The chief priests that can't really put a finger on what Jesus is. So instead of embracing him and his gospel, they decide to get rid of him. Perhaps they were scared. And then we have the people calling for Jesus' death. The mob, I like to call them. The mob mentality. The shouts that are infectious and they carry to crucify him. And then you have Pilate, who kind of seems like a puppet in all of this. He has basically brought this man, and these people are shouting, and at one point in the scripture, it does say that he becomes scared of the mob. So what is Pilate? A puppet of the people? Maybe? Somebody trying to stay in power? And then we go to the disciples, and at the beginning, we don't necessarily hear that the soldiers have grabbed the disciples or are holding them back, but at one point Jesus says to let them go, so they must have been restrained. Do we identify with the disciples who are being held back? Or what about Peter? Peter, the roller coaster of emotions that Peter is in this. At one point, at the beginning, he draws a sword and cuts the ear off of somebody. And then only a moment later does he deny knowing Jesus at all. Someone who is ready to fight, and then someone who is ready to run. Perhaps we've been there before. And then you have Judas, who is the one that brings the soldiers. He knows that he is born to betray. He knows that in his bones. And yet, at one point in the story, he falls to the ground. Does he doubt his decision? Is he driven by greed at first, but then overcome with love? And you don't hear about them in the beginning, but perhaps they are silently following the whole debacle, and that's the women. Jesus is the one that sees the women at the foot of the cross and speaks to his mother. Now, they don't really say much in the reading, but I can't imagine they were silent. I can't imagine they would witness this horror and not be crying out. Sobbing, perhaps. Weeping. How could you not? And at the same time, they are the most helpless of the group. They are the ones with the least amount of power and the ones who stick around. And then you have Jesus as our central character in this story. Jesus, who goes to the cross willingly in the book of John, who says, "I am he," and walks out of the garden. Jesus who suffers an ultimate suffering, an ultimate pain, and eventually dies. So given all these characters, there has to be somebody that we identify with. There has to be somebody that you see in this that you have been at one point. Perhaps it's multiple people. And I think that sometimes what we don't do in church, society, families, among friends, is we don't talk about the hard stuff very much. Perhaps it's too private, and we can't unload our suffering onto somebody else because maybe that would be too much for other people to handle. But I'm going to talk about it because it was about 5 years ago that I had a family member commit suicide. And nobody in our family talked about it. We didn't really know what was happening. And I can't change the past. I can't change what happened. I can't change communication. But I can talk about it now. Because when I look at the suffering of Jesus in this story, I don't necessarily identify with Jesus, but I know that there are people who do. I know that there are people who feel that they are suffering at an ultimate level. And if you look at the characters in this story, perhaps those characters are part of that suffering story as well. Sometimes when people are suffering from depression, there are others in their life that want to cheer them up, that want to say, "Oh, it's not that bad," that are in denial. Perhaps they are at one moment passionate about someone and the next moment they're denying them. Or somebody might be scared, so scared that they don't really want to hear the stories anymore that their friend is telling them. They don't want to hear the feelings, so they say, "Can you please stop telling those sad stories? You're making me sad." And then perhaps they don't call anymore, or answer texts, or come over for a visit. And sometimes there are people who do understand, but they're silent and they have no power. Like the women sitting at the feet of the cross. But the thing about this story of Jesus is that it's not a story. That God suffered. That God suffered just as we suffer. An ultimate suffering. Because when we are in those darkest places, when our family members are, when our friends are, God suffers with us. We call this in the church, we call it the theology of the cross. It sounds very academic, but what it means is that God goes along this journey with us every step of the way, even when we are at our most deepest pain. God has felt that pain too. And that is one of the reasons that God has called us into community. Over and over again, Jesus' message is love one another, pray for one another, pray for your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, lift one another up, be together in all pain, in all joy. We are called to this community in order to support one another. Because when one person is suffering, there are 10 more that can be there for that person to lift them up. In our reading in Hebrews, at the end of the reading there, it talks about people gathering together, that we are to encourage one another in all this hope and all this joy, because we are not Good Friday people. We have Good Friday because we understand in this ritual that God is with us in our suffering. But this is not where we stay. We are Easter people. We celebrate the risen Christ. We celebrate it every Sunday. And that is why we call this day good. Amen.